et à tous.
Hello everyone and welcome again.
Heureux de vous retrouver après.
Very happy to see you again after this great morning on youth and how youth can change the world. And this afternoon we'll talk about Europe. The President Hervé Morin this morning in the opening talked about Europe a lot. He kind of teased this upcoming debate on Europe. Is it a spineless spectator or a Mohican? Nicole Isotto is the one who created the title. She chairs the Scientific Council for Normandy for Peace, and she wanted us to gather the best specialists on this issue to talk about Europe, dropped by Trump's US, threatened by Putin's Russia, ignored and powerless spectator of the war. It's a moment of truth for Europe indeed. So, will the old continent accept its fate as a spineless spectator, witness, powerless, or to be the last Mohican, the last place for liberal freedom against the rise of individualism? And in order to contribute to the debate, I'm going to invite Nicole Isotto, Vice President of the Jacques Delors Institute. She wrote Fractures in the West, a book that inspired this debate. Jean-Louis Bourlange, former chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee at the National Assembly, former European MP and a recognized voice on European affairs. Welcome. Gilles Grissani, author, geopolitical specialist and director of Le Grand Continent publication. And finally, General Jérôme Pellistrandi, who needs no introduction. He's a chief editor-in-chief of the French National Defense Review. And remotely, through video conferencing from Greenland, Sarah Oslik, who is the chairwoman of the Inuit Interpolar Circle. We will be spending an hour and a half together to talk about Europe. Thank you so much to all of you for accepting our invitation here or a few thousand kilometers away. We know you have a very busy schedule. Thank you for taking the time. And first, Nicole, who we owe the title of the debate to, Spineless Spectator or Mohican. Your book is called Fractures of the West. How did we get there and how to come out of it? And you will be signing the book in the bookstore. And the last chapter in the book is called, like today's debate. What exactly did you mean by this? Well, first of all, thank you very much for being here, so many of you. It's very rare to hear such a round of applause for Europe, so we should enjoy that. I believe that right now Europe is in the middle of a nightmare. Everything happening in the world goes against the policies, the values, and the principles of European construction. We have two wars, one in the south, one in the east. The US ally is betraying the alliance, betraying democracy and international law. And international law is the foundation of Europe. The Chinese competition is undermining European trade and growth. There's domestic populism, which could end up being actual fascism. And of course, climate change, which is still there. So, all the great dynamics outside of Europe are going against Europe. The world is playing against Europe today. And we should keep this in mind if we want to know how to react. The only recent positive dynamic in the favor of the EU, correct me if I'm wrong, is that Iceland has changed its mind on entering the EU and is going to organize a referendum in July to determine whether they wanted to join the EU. That's the only positive event I was able to find. And in this nightmare that is the world, the Europeans must try and find a strategy, which is particularly difficult. And before we decide whether it's a spineless spectator or a Mohican, I would like to discuss why it's so difficult for Europe to adapt. And we need to go back in history for this. When Europe was created in the 1950s, there were three pillars of its DNA. First, forget the war. No geopolitics. Don't think of this. Europe created 2 world wars, so it's over. No geopolitics. Just think about peace and nothing else. Second pillar of the DNA, trade. You can get richer. It could stabilize the outside of Europe, so go 100% into trade. And the third injunction was to trust the US. Since you cannot work on peace, the US will do it for you. These are the 3 principles that allowed Europe to become one of the greatest economical and trade powers on the planet up until the early 2000s. No war, trade, and the US. But now, the world we live in has forced the EU to completely change those 3 principles and to learn how to do exactly what she couldn't do for decades. Europe needs to learn about war. You see that all Europeans' defense budgets have increased by more than 18% over the past 5 or 6 years. Europe needs to learn to not trust trade too much, because trade is geopolitical and she shouldn't trust China or the aggressive trade from the US, and be cautious with the US. The US betrays the alliance, supports fascist movements, including in Germany and the UK, and that does not respect international law. And if I'm saying this, it's because we really need to understand that adapting to this new world is a much bigger challenge for Europe than any other country. All countries must adapt to this global craziness, but it's even more difficult for Europe because it's a complete revolution compared to its practices over the past 8 decades. And then there's this double choice, which I discuss at length in my book. I won't be too long. I've already spoken for 4 minutes. And this choice is what I called a spineless spectator or a Mohican. By being spineless, we mean accepting the world is changing without us, against us, but regardless, we have no choice. We must accept that. Many Europeans think like this, meaning, after all, Trump is only here for a while, you just need to ignore, wait, and he'll lose the elections, the midterms in November, and then the US will be more reasonable, accepting that he does not respect international law, because if he ends up just destroying dictatorships like Venezuela or Iran, it might be acceptable. Accepting that protectionism is back in the front line, because if it can protect national industries, maybe it's not so bad. That's the first tendency, and I think it's quite widespread, and it's leading to a further alignment of Europe to the US in the name of a Western community that should be defended against all other disruptors. I believe we should speak out against this strategy, reject it, but many of our European partners are following this line. And then next to that, there is resistance, meaning rejecting everything I just mentioned while remaining smart enough to avoid becoming a revolution radical. We cannot pretend like the world is not changing. We cannot stay the same. We cannot remain the Europe of the 90s. So we need to adapt, at least a little. There are many things we can accept. A certain level of protectionism, for example. It is true that liberalism and free competition, ultra-liberalism like Thatcher or Reagan, has negative impacts. So it's good to have some political control over the craziness of the markets, especially financial markets. We can also accept the return of defense. It makes sense that a huge power like the EU has the means to defend itself, even autonomously. But there are two things we should resist, and I'll conclude with this. There are two things where we should make no compromise. International law, on the one hand, I'll speak about this tomorrow morning, but international law is unique. It's like being pregnant for a woman. You cannot be half pregnant. Either you are or you're not. And it's the same for international law. Either you respect it or you don't. And because Europe is basically just law, it's a few pages of a treaty. There's no European nation or a language or a common culture. It's about the law. And of course, democracy. Because if Europe is not the political entity that defends the law and democracy, then no one else in the world will do it for us. No other international player will do it for us. So a bit of a spineless spectator and a lot of a Mohican.
Merci pour introduire ainsi.
Well, thank you for your introduction. Clearly, Europe and the world are going through a crisis, and it's not the first time Jérôme Palestrandi, in his memoir, Jean Monnet used to say that Europe will be created through crises and the sum of the solutions brought to these crises. So, what makes this current moment unique? Over the past 41 days, I've been watching real-time news channels and speaking on those TV channels to explain a major conflict in a region in the Middle East with global consequences. And that's an important aspect. When I started in the military as a simple soldier, I celebrated my 20th birthday in Berlin. I crossed the Charlie checkpoint, for those who remember it. That was the Berlin Wall, to go to East Berlin in my uniform. That was 1981. Look where we're standing today. My first message is that Europe is a major chance. And as Europeans, if we don't have a reflection in the current crisis, we're going straight into a disaster. We have observed two main changes from a military perspective. First of all, the war in Ukraine, 24th of February 2022. More than 4 years now that we have a very high intensity war in Europe, and our own security is directly threatened by Russia. And then, of course, this geopolitical shift on the 28th of February. And on that date, in the morning of the 28th of February, when we started commenting what was going on, I felt, and I'll speak under the authority of two great Europeans, Jean-Louis Bourlange and Louis Colby-Soto, I would like to highlight the same thing that happened in November 1989 when Eastern German representative opened a gate, and nobody could imagine the consequences of this action when he opened a gate. When people went west in Berlin, and the consequences of the fall of the wall and the Soviet Empire. And what was triggered on the 28th of February will have huge consequences, just as big, and will disrupt the geopolitical balances that we knew so far. And here, we are facing a war that is not our war, but the consequences directly impact us. And this is fundamental. Up until now, and we should insist on this, up until now the Europeans were united. For once, we're not so much of a spineless spectator. And as Nicole was saying, we must be very firm on the fundamental principles that created international relations since World War II. This is a crucial element, and I'm speaking to you, the youngest in the audience. We paid the price of two wars, the First and the Second World War, and Caen is a symbol of this war, and now we're facing an existential threat because the US, or at least the Trump administration, is completely out of line talking about destroying an entire civilization. Imagine what this means from the president of the power that set us free, destroying an entire civilization. So the European scale is crucial, especially when it comes to defense. Because, yes, just to think that we cannot just claim we need to apply international law. We need to be able to demonstrate our determination without joining the current war. But it means we need to show we are ready through our European system to act and to try and find, again, some sort of balance. But when you ask me what's ahead of us, I'm unable to tell. But the European level is crucial. We cannot be a spineless Europe. We need to be a determined Europe. Thank you, General. Of course, in a moment we'll talk about the defense architecture. And as you said, in order not to be destroyed, you need to prepare yourself. And military power is, again, a key factor to have weight on the business of the world. But Europe was never built as an aggressive power. And now Europe needs to prepare to get the right arms. But as Nicole said, Europe is about peace and prosperity. So how can a European project based on preparing for war be accepted? And how can this preparation be done without being detrimental to other European aspects? The Draghi report mentioned it. Can it be a mix of both, or is there a choice that needs to be made? Thank you. I'm very happy to be with you today. And I'd like to tell you a story. It's not about spineless animals, but fish. It's the story of two fish swimming, and they meet a third fish, and the fish tells the other two, "How's the water today?" The two fish go away, but one turns around and says, "What is water?" And actually, when you try and understand what peace is about, you need to think about the story with two fish that are swimming in the water without wondering what water is. What is this water they're swimming in? And if I'm saying this, it's because it's quite mechanical. You immediately realize what water is when you end up on the shelf of the fishmonger. And now, a big share of humanity, there was a survey 1 week ago that we made, and more than 50% of humanity is currently living in a country that is engaged in a conflict. It's not a global conflict. There are no united fronts, but there is a proliferation that seems unprecedented in different types of conflicts that are very different. There are traditional conflicts opposing armies and countries. There are untraditional conflicts with states and non-state forces like the jihad in Sahel or the cartels in Latin America. And we're seeing more and more types of wars that have an imperial matrix, Of course, we all think of Vladimir Putin's war against Ukraine, which is quite clear now over more than 4 years, and other types of wars that are a mix of these. The war mentioned by General Pellistrandi, that there seems to be some sort of ceasefire, temporary one, that is like this. And somehow we are still protected from that. We remain spectators of these phenomena. The closer you get to the borders where there is a conflict, you can feel it, and you can start to wonder how to approach that. But we're also seeing the emergence of a deep discourse from European leaders saying we need to give up on what they call dreams or illusions. Give up on this idea that peace and prosperity make us able to do things together, and give up on dreams, as Pascal Lamy said. Stopping common dreams and doing it with common nightmares instead. And I think this discourse is both relevant but also very dangerous. Because we need to realize that we are fish who enjoy swimming in the water because water allows us to live. And that's what peace is about. You know, the great author Raymond Aron, who did a lot of essays on peace, when he entered the French Academy, he was able to choose the motto he wanted to write on his sword. And he chose a quote from Herodot, a quote that might be surprising when you know Aron, and if you don't, then I recommend you read his books, because he was a thinker who was a realist who worked on preparing for war, and he chose a very interesting quote. No one is unreasonable enough to prefer war to peace. And I think that's where it becomes particularly strategic. We know what peace is about. And we also know how to create a project based on peace. Nicole Nisotto reminded us of something quite interesting. We are at a time where empires are creating wars to open borders and conquer territories. And Europe is the only continent with an extension of borders but without a war. We have been speaking for years now about Ukraine joining, as Russia is leading a war to avoid that and trying to conquer territory. And Nicole, you mentioned the case of Iceland, where this is an island in the middle of the Atlantic that tries to join the Union. And this is our strength. But we shouldn't be naive either. We need to be strong enough to maintain the strength. And that's where it's a difficult choice. You need to keep the same trajectory while changing it. And that's the debate between being spineless or a Mohican. This question makes sense because we continue to be submissive, which is supported by what the European peoples want. A vast, impressive majority on the continent of people who just want to be able to say no to violence, who have a very hard vision of what's happening in Washington today. The regime changes from Donald Trump, which question the alliance, but also the democracy in the US, leaving the cooperation framework, some sort of Warsaw Pact with a decision in the US, and then Europe aligning with it, with the decision of one man, Donald Trump. And we see a vast majority of people who just want to be able to say no in Europe. But being able to say no to an alternative model of conflict. And I think we should step away from this idea that we are powerless. It's the opposite. Our power is the power of the people. And for the first time in a long time, around and behind Europe, there's a vast popular demand that goes beyond just reforms or stagnation, but more of a revolutionary or pre-revolutionary dynamic. And I think it's a crucial element. It's not really about being the last Mohican, but the first one, actually. That's what we need to learn. We have a model today that resonates with a vast majority of humanity, living in peace and prosperity, being able to develop. Of course, this requires a complete change because we are now in a world that has been disrupted by the digital revolution. Our political institutions are decoded, undermined, and we need to find a way to retranslate those dynamics based on this will. So I think Raymond Aron is right in the end. No one is unreasonable enough not to prefer peace to war, but we need to want this reason and make it desirable. That's the current challenge.
Thank you. Now we're going to speak about this desire of Europe, and we are going to turn to Greenland. You can, of course, if you want to speak or react, just raise your hand and we'll give you the microphone. Before we go to Greenland, this desire for Europe, Jean-Louis Bourlange, how does Europe, how can Europe at the same time adapt without negating its values? What are the challenges today? What I'm worried about in this debate is that we're saying Europe, a spineless beast, or last of the Mohicans. These are two negative. A spineless beast is nothing fantastic, and the last of the Mohicans, he's the last. Because we know that at the end of the book, the last of the Mohicans disappears. We don't want to be any spineless beast and no mass last of the Mohicans. And as Xavier Priolo said, we need to adapt in order to survive. I think that what I want to pass on as a message to you is that the European Union, Europe as a whole, not just the European Union, united has never been as necessary, and this for two reasons. The first of all is our decline. All the indicators showing in terms of population growth, in terms of technology, in terms of economy, in terms of military power, everything shows that during the last 30 years, we are on a clear weakening, on a decline of our position compared to the rest of the world. That is something that we need to stop. We're not going to stop it everywhere. We're not going to start producing millions of babies, but there are decisions that need to be taken. And we need to really think that we're engaged in a decline process, and this process needs to be stopped or slowed down. The second thing that is important is that we're almost the only ones since the United States are going a downward trend in a fairly uncertain, and I'm speaking politely. We are the only defenders of the fundamental rights of three humanism: the social democratic humanism, the social liberal, and the Catholic humanism. These three humanism on which was based our European civilization, and that has given us things that are irreplaceable. Liberal democracy, the rule of law, the share of power, the fundamental rights, freedom of speech, freedom of meeting, of association, freedom of conscience, all things are important in that they are threatened. Today, 10% only of the European state, of the worldwide states, have the right to have these fundamental. For us in Europe, they're fundamental because they're ours, but it's not natural for people living in other countries, and we are losing these values. The liberal democracy model, an international model, that makes that we have never separated ever since the end of World War II the necessity of the military alliance between our states, a refusal from nationalism and an ideological deep solidarity. That was the strength of the Western alliance, and the strength of the European Union is that we were united by values first, by common ideas. And what threatens us today is that we are seeing message coming from the United States that say, we don't care about your values anymore, just deal with it without us, and our alliances are not interesting. So we are, and finally the third system that is deeply European, the inseparability between economic development, growth, investment, technological challenges, and the social justice, taken into account the major human risks. Ladies and gentlemen, this is fundamental, and this is being threatened. This is the message that you keep in mind. This is being threatened from all sides, politically, economically. I'm not going to come back on that. But based on this, as Mr. Priolo said, or Xavier, my good friend Xavier, Europe, as the way it is organized today, does not allow to meet these challenges. So we need a threefold adaptation. First of all, we need to accept new tasks. We have built Europe by cultivating peace among ourselves, Germans and French, for instance, because we had fought 3 wars. And then economic development. We wanted to get out of this protectionism that was limiting before the war, that had not taken us very far. So this is clearly stated now. We've done it, but now there's something else. We are confronted on a threat to our values. We thought they were universal values, but you can see that they are contested everywhere. So we need to be strong. We need to meet the challenge of the reciprocity and not just be an exemplary. We need to be able to hold our place in a world with our values. The idea is not to sacrifice our values, saying that if our values are universal for us, they are not universally adjusted by and accepted by everyone. So our task is very important. We have not done for this. And the second thing is the territory. We can see that faced with Putin, the Europeans of the European Union are divided. We have some of them, the Hungarians, the Slovakians, others in the Balkans, that are the weak links of the resistance against Putin. And we see, on the other hand, people that are outside of the European Union. Iceland, if they're joining us, there isn't. Denmark was also not very hard on committing to Europe, and they've moved closer. Norway, that is outside of the EU, even though in the associate state now they're moving closer. Even the UK, who left the EU, suddenly understand that their destiny is joined with ours. And of course, Sweden. So we have a European defense that is not the same as the European Union. And so that causes an institutional issue, and we also have an institutional issue. We have built Europe in order to take decisions in a common, unanimous decision. Almost, we recently only voted the qualified majority, but it's almost unanimity by other means. And we can see that these methods that we had, they allow to establish standards and norms, a rule of play, but does not allow us to fight to win. And we are confronted with a major challenge. How can we have a political system that could work, that could actually work? And that is the third challenge that we need absolutely to meet. So, dear friends, these are the 3 challenges. I'm an old man. I'm not the one who needs to provide the answers. You need to provide the answers to these 3 challenges. Accept the new tasks of the European Union, accept the new realities, the new trends of a territory that is going to be diverse, and the institutional logics with a financial investment. Europe is only 1% of the GDP in terms of budget. That's not how we're going to be strong. So we need to, these are the 3 challenges we need to pick up. And here I'm changing the title of this conference. Nicole said Europe is either spineless or last of the Mohicans. I would say this is completely different. Europe Spineless beast, no. Mohican, no, but European, yes.
Jean-Louis Bourlange, vous devrez...
Jean-Louis Bourlange, you should go into politics, Jean-Louis Bourlange. You're not ready to retire yet. Okay, now let's change brackets. And in the actual moment, it's of course the transatlantic relation, this relationship of trust that's broken down with the US of Donald Trump. Thank you, Sarah Alvik. You're joining in from Nuuk, capital of Greenland. What happened in Greenland was unthinkable up until a recent. You are a Greenland politician. You are president of the Inuit Interpolar Council. How does the Inuit people live the actual period? There's numerous hands that are trying to grab Greenland, particularly the US. How did you see what happened? And has this reinforced the attachment of the Inuit people to the European values?
Bonjour. Thank you so much for the invitation to this excellent panel. I'm happy to be able to join from Nuuk, Galashiq Nunaat, Greenland. And these are very interesting questions indeed that have also put focus on some of the issues that we are facing here in Galashiq Nunaat and the Arctic. Firstly, I want to remind that we as Inuit, we live across 4 very different nation states. As an indigenous people of the Arctic, we have lived here for time immemorial, for thousands of years. We've seen settlers, colonizers, others coming in and out of our lands and territories, and we have been able not just to survive, but thrive in the Arctic with specialized skills to be an Arctic people and to live from the resources with the ice, on the ice, in a frozen landscape, which we call our home, which is the Arctic. So we are not an empty piece of ice. I think that's important to say very clearly. As Inuit, we live both here in Galashiq Nunaat, Greenland, in Canada, in the US, Alaska, so that's the Arctic US, and also in the Arctic Russia, in Chukotka. And we as Inuit were here before states were formed. And we have worked over the past 5 decades to re-establish our ties as Inuit across those state borders. What we share as Inuit is that our homelands are now part of states that were established on the basis of power that exists south of us, outside of our homelands. And we have been striving and working and pushing to achieve self-determination. A self-determination right that is inherent to us, not just because it's written on paper or it's recognized in the UN, that I will come back to, but because we are peoples that are here in the Arctic and have been here for time immemorial, distinct peoples with our own culture, our own languages, and our own ways of living, ways of being. And so I think it's important to remember from a European perspective that when we look at the Arctic, you should turn the globe and you should look at the Arctic with the North Pole in the center. And you will really truly get an understanding of how we live in the circumpolar area, that we are not an empty space, but we are a land around a sea where peoples live. And many indigenous peoples have been living here in the Arctic for time immemorial. So I would actually say that I don't fully agree that the past years are surprising. For us, it's been the story of our lives, the story of our political history, that someone else wants to grab our resources and our land. And so we have been resilient in that sense, that we have always maintained our distinct identity, and our rights of self-determination is something that we've been working towards with much determination and much perseverance. And what we share across the Arctic, that we also share with the states that we live in, is the vision of maintaining peace and cooperation in our region, in our homeland, the Arctic. And that has never been an easy task. Our organization was established in 1977. That was in the midst of the Cold War, and it was a challenge to get in touch and be in contact and re-establish the human-to-human, people-to-people ties with Inuit in Russia at that time. And we've now spent 5 decades doing so. And we will continue to do so, as we have already shown that when the world around us increases its tension in our region and their attention to our region, we are the ones who have the constant and stable voice of being the peoples of the Arctic who are insisting on peace and cooperation across state borders. And we have done the same in this situation where Galashiq Nunat, where I live, have been at the world's attention. So our very clear response last year, in January 2025, was that there's simply no such thing as a better colonizer. And I think it's extremely important to continue to remember that sentence and that perspective to anyone's attention to the Arctic, anyone who is not an Arctic nation and people. Their attention to the Arctic should be guided by the mantra that there is no such thing as a better colonizer. What we are calling for is dignified dialogue through diplomatic channels, through and based on international law, with the respect of the human rights of us who live in the Arctic. And I think here there's a certain task for France, and there's a certain task for Europe. We have been building, as we've just heard, the instruments that we all rely on in the international cooperation. And those instruments include both the recognition and the affirmation of the rights of indigenous peoples, the individual rights of indigenous peoples, and also the collective rights of indigenous peoples. And we continue to struggle with European states to fully recognize and implement the collective and individual rights of indigenous peoples based on and as enshrined in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which was of course adopted by the UN in 2007. So yes, we are standing at a rupture, and what is warming my heart as a Inuk person, a person from Greenland also, is that we are seeing a values-based alliance forming around us, from middle powers to small powers to indigenous peoples from all over the world who are standing shoulder by shoulder with us in Galashiq Nunat, Greenland, which has become the symbol of this rupture that we are all addressing. And this is such an important development, which also provides some hope that there are states and peoples around the globe who are aligning with us based on the values of upholding international law and human rights, which of course includes the rights of indigenous peoples. So I would like to invite everyone in your room here in this conference to deeply and carefully consider how France and Europe should also improve your attention and implementation of the rights of indigenous peoples. This is the time where the champions of human rights must step up and be the champions, do the championing in every aspect of whatever you're doing internationally, regionally, and nationally. And for us as indigenous peoples, we need those alliances to hold up the promise that we fought for so hard with the states through 25 years of negotiations for the recognition of the rights of indigenous peoples as enshrined in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So Europe certainly does play a role also for us who live outside of Europe. We need strong partnerships and equal partnerships with full recognition of peoples equal to all other peoples, also being indigenous peoples, and engagement with us, making sure that we do not repeat the wrongdoings and mistakes of the past, remembering that for us there is no such thing as a better colonizer, and in engaging with us, the full respect must also be promoted and protected of our right to self-determination. And so I will end my comments here and look forward to the dialogue. Thank you so much.
Merci.
Thank you, Sarah Olsvik, for this call for dialogue, cooperation, and recognition of self-determination rights. There's a beautiful exhibition at the moment in the Village for Peace on the Inuit people, a photo exhibition in partnership together with the festival on women's photographers. It's a beautiful, go and have a look at these beautiful pictures. So Kalalit Nunaat, Greenland, has given away on a study on the wider continent, which called the Greenland moment. It's also a change in position on the European audience on the relationship with the United States. This is also a change in point of view. 73% now of Europeans think that the Union can only rely on itself to defend its interdependency. Can you say more about this, what we have learned from the study you have carried out? Yes, absolutely. There's something that looks at this Greenland moment for the European audience that is maybe an acceleration and maybe also at the same time a change of point of view, something that is now obvious since January 2025. To understand this, we need to do a small step backwards and try to think, what is Donald Trump? Try to defend it. We continue interpreting Donald Trump as a geopolitical factor, which he is, of course, but he does not work in our life as other normal politicians used to work. You can be someone who is not interested in politics. You can not know the name of the French Prime Minister. Well, they changed so often that it's always hard to remember. But nevertheless, but even if you come from this region, you might not even know the name of the French Prime Minister, even though he comes from Normandy. But you have certainly seen Donald Trump yesterday and today. He's everywhere. He's a figure that is far more like a movie star like Brigitte Bardot, Mick Jagger, or now and suddenly you discover that Donald Trump, yeah, he's blonde like Brigitte Bardot. And yeah, of course, he's got an age difference, but she's clearly older than Sebastian O'Connor. But concretely, he exists as a spectacular figure. He's constantly all over our media, screens, and I mean, there's lots of people here who have not laughed when we spoke about Brigitte Bardot because they don't know who Brigitte Bardot is. But I'm showing my age here. But there's something that is fundamental. Actually, Donald Trump, he's building a very deep imaginary function. He's reconfiguring the way we consider not so much politics, but life in itself. So concretely, he is there, omnipresent. He's a certain dimension. And for a year and a couple of months, we can see that it's not necessarily a negative figure. It's an aggressive methods. He's a predator. When he's supporting a political movement, it's not for more sovereignty. It's more in order to break down these forms of sovereignty, which is is a huge problem for the sovereignty movement in Europe, because when they are attacked by Donald Trump, even though they thought he was an ally, but he's reconsolidating the entire political spectrum, going from the center to the extreme far left. We find a deep convergence that we could define around a simple question. It's a desire for resistance. It's the fact that we are analyzing the situation. We know that Donald Trump is more and more acting against our interest. And at the same time, we feel that this will not be able to be resolved without a balance of power. And this is where I think the moment of Greenland was a key moment. We went, if you remember, from a chronological point of view, there was something that was silently present even before Donald Trump came back to the White House. During the Christmas message in 2024, Donald Trump was writing that he wanted to annex Canada, Panama and Greenland. It was kind of like a joke, and people saying, it's Donald Trump, let's not take him seriously. But more and more, it's become even more loud. The demands are more and more explicit, openly and confidentially, with world leaders. At one moment, he even nominates a special envoy who says that he's working actively to annex Greenland, knowing that we know that there are operations of that there's forms of corruption, of insurrectional movements that are prepared, but everything that changes everything is the military operation that is dealt in with Maduro in Venezuela. We said, okay, he wasn't joking, he could really do it. And this is where the opinion changed in the understanding from the Europeans, and not just the elites, but how serious the threat is, and the fact that we need to concretely take into account this threat. And what happened is interesting. You end up in countries, the study was carried out it's a survey that we carried out in about 10 countries and allowed us to really understand what the European public opinion was in the months of February regarding this attempt of conquest, of imperial conquest. And what we saw, there was a majority of opinions in all the European countries that agreed on this point. Even countries who were at war, who were allied with the United States, who have complicated relationships with the United States. For Denmark, it's kind of understandable, but for Italy, for instance, as you know, Italy has a very tight relationships with the United States, and also it's a country that has a very complex relationship regarding war. So, but the level of support to a defensive operation, of sending European troops in order to be able to defend Kalalit Nunaat from any form of action, was widely majoritarian. Even in Meloni's, the Italian Prime Minister's country, a majority of Italians agreed that we should send troops to a very distant territory. Most Italians wouldn't even be able to name, to place Greenland on a map, not because it's an abstract geopolitical issue, but it's because it's a very concrete aspect. It's concerned of this deep aggression that Donald Trump is trying to do. And I conclude on that. I think that we need to take into account that we're faced with a situation that's completely new. There's a political energy that is very intense, very deep, that exists today, that for the first time ask us to implement a form of resistance and of protection. And faced with that, it's kind of a constant back and forth that sometimes are almost extreme. We could say, by making a play on word, is that in the Mullah regime, Mark Rutte, the head of the NATO, could be the supreme guide. And faced with this, we have a public opinion that could examine something else. And when we're faced in this situation, there's a differential between the public offer and the politic dimension. You have two possibilities. Either we have a moment where supply and demand come together and the majority of people follow the trend, or nothing moves and the system blows up in the end, like a river that would be held up by a dam and the dam would break. So we really haven't got the time to ask ourselves the question, are we going to evolve into one situation or the other? The time is here, the energy is here, and so we'll have to understand if we'll have the capacity of following the trend towards either evolution or stagnation. Thank you, Gilles Gressani. So we just mentioned the public opinion, but to react to what Jean-Louis Bourlange said on the issue of territories, we also have within the European territory, we have nuances, we have differences of views, where in the voices of some states that that do not pull in the same direction and we're outside of the European territory. We have trends that are pushing us, that are supporting us. We have Norway, we have Canada, the UK. How do we manage at the same time these aggressions from within, sometimes via proxy forces from Russia, inspired Russia, and this perimeter, these scopes that are not exactly aligned anymore? Huh? I think this is a very important question. I think the answer is we have to, of course, to be extremely flexible in our reactions and to be creative in our reaction. I mean, if we take a clear example, Hungary. Hungary has two negative aspects. First of all is that they systematically do not comply with a certain number of legal, financial and accounting issues, meaning that we don't exactly know the way the money, particularly the European taxpayers' money, is being spent. Faced with this, we have reactions, we have possible reactions, which we're using, because, for instance, Hungary needs European funds and receives the European budget, European funds. So we need to have the, to be brave enough to exert sanctions, and it is absolutely abnormal that part of the taxpayers' money from the European not be clearly controlled, and that there is reporting based on what the law prescribes. And what is far more interesting is we have seen what had happened in Ukraine. The Europeans want to, the vast majority of Europeans, they want to help Ukraine. The decision needs to be taken at unanimously, and Hungary is against. I have seen that an important political personality in France said that it was very good. That was the model, and that is how you would defend your sovereignty. I'm surprised to consider that the French sovereignty, or German or Italian, be defended by preventing an initiative that we want to take by a state of a couple of million inhabitants, who's an important state. They are entitled to their position, even though it's not our position. But then the traditional Europeans said, we need to take the decision at the qualified majority. Globally qualified majority means that 2/3 of the states that represent 2/3 of the population need to be in agreement. But that is a problem on issues of life and death. If we don't want to send French people being killed on the Ukrainian battlefields, that doesn't work. But we can find solutions, and we'll find solutions that are volunteer forces. We told the Hungarians, okay, you don't want to participate, we're not going to force you to take a decision you want to take, but we have about 440 million Europeans who want to help Ukraine, and we are going to do it without you, but we are not going to let you dictate our position because you're ultra-minoritarian to our ultra-majority union in its desires. This is just an example coming from the other point of view, the one of the association of states that are outside, that are part globally of what we call the volunteers. The example of Canada is very interesting. Everyone appreciated and approved among the people who are thinking about the fundamental rule of law. Everyone liked the speech of the European Prime Minister in Davos. It was a historical speech. He said that the powerful states, the powerful peoples who were the middle powers that recognize themselves in these values need to organize their efforts in order to impose their point of view and resist to imperialistic tendency. And he was clearly aiming for the Donald Trump's imperialism. So this is very interesting, and it really requires that we invent forms of cooperation, but we already did that by combining states through agreements in a structural manner that share these values. It's true that it's important to have Canada with us, and It's important to have Iceland, even though they're not a member yet. It's important to have Greenland, Kalaallit with that. I mean, via Denmark, they are part of the agreement. All this is important, but we can find solutions, but we need to imagine them. And the last issue, and I want to finish on that, that is very difficult, is the military issue. Because we want to be independent from the United States for a very simple reason, is that President Trump is telling us that if we were attacked, he would not be defending us. That is a complete change of position regarding the commitments of its predecessors since World War II. All the US presidents always said that we were linked like the two fingers of the same hand. So based on this new position, we need to get organized, but our common organization is done via NATO. NATO is widely dominated by the US. So we have a true issue here, and we need to invent forms of political cooperation, of operational programming and industrial mobilization, and buying raw materials that would be common to all the Europeans who want to build their own defense. That is a huge project. We're talking about it. We're talking constantly about it. And this could, we've been talking for years to this changing in Europe, this differentiation. Of course, the question of the defense is central. I now asking Nicole Niesotto and Gerard Pellistrandi globally on the idea of an independent sovereign Europe regarding the Greenland and the study of the grand continent. What does it mean, being independent in a world that's completely interdependent, and Europe doesn't have the means of being completely independent? So what are the compromise areas? What are the possible discussions? And on the more specific on defense of the European defense architecture. And thank you to Sarah Olvig, Europe, NATO, the defense. What are the possible scenarios?
D'abord, si je peux faire quelques...
I'd like to make a few comments on what others said, briefly, about Hungary. Hungary is showing something very important so we understand the world we live in. It's not like there's the evil guys on one side, the US, China, Russia, and the good guys, the Europeans, who defend values and principles. We also have the same problem with us. There's very strong populism in Europe. Orban, who's going to put his seat at play. On Sunday, there are elections supported by the US. Yes, Orban is the European Trump. So we shouldn't oppose the evil outside of Europe and the good guys in Europe defending universal principles. We also have that problem at home. This is also partly why we're divided and powerless. And about Hungary, I would like to insist. First of all, for the Jacques Delors Institute, which I represent today, we wrote a paper 5 years ago saying that the only solution was to not pay the 4% of its GDP to Hungary every year, but since we want to respect the treaty, to put it in a safe and a bank. Again, people were telling us, are you crazy? You're dreaming. It goes against the treaty. Now everybody says we should have done this earlier. So we need to be creative, have imagination. And regarding the Hungary case, the fact that they're blocking 90 billion loans we owe to Ukraine is a scandal. Not a Hungarian scandal, but a European one, because there was a qualified majority decision as part of a permanent structure cooperation. And according to the treaty, it says once the decision was made, and it was made with Hungary, you cannot stop it. And now they're doing it. But we are responsible for this blocking. It's a bit technical, but I wanted to insist. Hungary is on the wrong side, but the European Council is on the weak side. Now, your question, independence. Being independent does not mean being alone. It does not mean we're doing everything alone all the time and better than anyone else. No. It simply means that you need to choose where you're dependent. And this is an collective action. Europeans must agree on what area they won't be able to be independent for at least a certain period. For example, there is one area where you cannot be independent. That is fossil fuels, because we don't have any. So we need to import them. However, we can decide to limit or reduce or get rid of this dependency to fossil fuels by quickly accelerating the transition to sustainable fuels, electrification, by getting rid of our needs for fossil fuels. And this is collective political will. We need to quickly develop common energy policy where we don't need shale gas from the US or Russian gas, etc. This is a choice of independence through relative dependence from the South, but that leads us to independence. Another example, military dependency. I have been advocating for 40 years for an autonomous European defense, meaning a European defense mobilizing Europeans for wars that is interesting to them, not other people's wars. So the principle of the de Gaulle's Europe, de Gaulle exited NATO in 1966 because he didn't want France to be taken into a war that is not its war. So first and foremost, we need to agree on that. And unfortunately, I must say, we don't all agree on this idea of military independence. But if we were to agree, then we need to choose the path we should use. And this goes through a temporary dependency to the US. As long as we haven't built the right material and the instruments in Europe to replace the equipment and the US structures. So once again, autonomy and independence are an objective that could be possible through temporary dependency, but it must be a consensual political objective. And right now, consensus with 27 countries is almost impossible. So one of the options is to create a consensus with less than 27 members. And as Europe is extended, we will need less people for a consensus. But if we get a consensus with the 5 or 6 greatest powers, France, Germany, Poland, Spain, and Italy, all of us 5 account for almost 90% of the military potential of the EU. If we create a common will with those 5 countries, then we have a clear path. I would like to quote somebody who's not a European, it's Walt Disney, and I'm quoting this from a speech from the governance of the French bank, who loves quoting Walt Disney, because Walt Disney used to say, the difference between a dream and a project, and remember that for your life, the difference between a dream and a project is a calendar, a schedule, simple, the schedule for the states, etc. That's what we need to do. We need ideas, but we need a schedule to get there, a timeline. Methodology. Général Peristrandi. We will now talk about security and defense and a new architecture. Nicole, amongst the countries you mentioned, you didn't mention the UK because it's no longer in the EU. For a very long time, we heard about a European pillar of defense and NATO, but can you tell us what are the potential scenarios and challenges? I'm sorry, I'm constantly looking at my phone, but I'm just trying to follow what's happening in Iran. And Donald Trump just woke up and he sent a tweet to attack NATO. So when you talk about schedule, dreams, or projects, whatever happens, I think the question we're going to have to ask is, how long will NATO last in its current format? Weeks, months, maybe. It's an old debate. Defending Europe or European defense. We have had dozens of symposiums and hours of debates on this issue. But where are we standing today? For our European partners, and that includes the UK or Canada, when we talk about defense, they immediately think about NATO. And thinking that we could replace NATO by a military structure that would report to the European Commission, this is utopia. The problem is how to turn NATO with more or less US, with also the fact that within NATO, the strategic cultures vary as well. As if you're Polish or Swedish, your problem is Russia, which makes sense. So the efforts in defense as part of NATO are focusing on this existential threat. For the Baltic states, it is an existential threat. If you're in Portugal, it's on the other side of Europe. And as part of NATO, there is no direct threat onto your territory, but you are still part of this collective alliance because it's the result of history. And you need to federate people around this. The issue being that France is a specific case. We talked about the General de Gaulle. I'm trying to advertise my latest publication on the French army. It was published 2 weeks ago. We are the only European country that has a very narrow link between the political structure and the military issue because Generals de Gaulle and the Fifth Republic, which is not the case of Germany. In Germany, the army is like an administrative tool that's wearing a uniform. And for other countries, the defense function is almost secondary in the concept of political power. In France, it's different. The head of state is also the leader of the army, and this is no joke. But we realize that the biggest cohesion in Europe, in this extended version of Europe, is not a cohesion between France and Germany, but between France and the UK. With the acceleration since Ukraine, since Greenland, this real-life military alliance is France and the UK. Even more so because they have the nuclear weapon. And this is probably the direction we're heading. It could indeed happen that Trump says, I'm going to quit NATO, I want to punish the European countries that are mean to me, like Spain, for example, but the Pentagon will say, I need the US bases in Europe. So it won't be a full exit. But it is necessary and urgent for the Europeans to gain and acquire more responsibilities in this collective defense. Up until now, and I've done it a lot, when you talked to the military, and I'm actually going to quote two ministers of the army, Florence Parly said, Article 5 does not mean F-35, which is a reference to the planes that many European countries bought, which gave them complete dependency to the US, even being submissive when it comes to using F-35. And I will quote another former minister of the army, who's now prime minister, who said, France has a defense industry and Germany has the defense of its industry. If you compare those two quotes, you will immediately understand all the challenges we're facing.
Merci, Général, pour cette explication.
Thank you, General, for those clear explanations. Sarah Osvig, NATO had a major role in the negotiations with Trump and the Trump administration. What is your approach in Greenland on those debates about the future of NATO, on the new architecture of defense? What is your analysis?
Well, firstly, of course, I cannot speak on behalf of the government of Greenland, as I represent Inuit that live both in Greenland and in Canada, Alaska, and the US. So Alaska is the US and Chukotka, Russia. But I do take note, and I think it was a smart move, as Inuit have been good at for many, many years, to be strategically silent at certain times. And this was one of those examples. Being able to partner with partners from abroad to pave the way for certain things to happen. And I do think that many times we see that the surrounding world forgets that Greenland is a democracy, that we have a government, we have a parliament, they have their own strategies, they have their own policies, and they are capable, fully capable of working with partners from around the world, like, for example, as you mentioned, that NATO, being a part of NATO through Denmark. And I think that just like we see how you in Europe are standing in front of complex and very difficult choices and decisions to make, so does the people of Kalaallit Greenland. It has been no doubt about the path towards self-determination in the form of statehood in the past many rounds of terms in parliament and government. The question has more been about the speed of things and with whom to partner, with whom to be an ally. And we've seen a very clear development from the government of Greenland in aligning themselves very clearly with the Western Alliance. And now in this rupture that we're seeing, we've seen the clear turn towards the Nordics and the European states. And so I think that we are not only as Inuit peoples and a people of Kalaallit Greenland only on the receiving end. And I think that will be the big task for Europe and the Nordics, to understand that there's also a need to adjust and use the flexibility that we just heard about to accommodate those possibilities of strengthening the ties and allyships with a nation such as Kalaallit Greenland. What we do know about the Arctic in terms of governance, and that includes the military and security governance structures and aspects of the development, is that we cannot just think that everything can be done in the same way as it was done after the Second World War or at the time of the Cold War. Because in the meantime, self-government structures have been developing. And we have seen one after the other of self-government agreements being inaugurated and implemented across the Arctic. And so when we take decisions as indigenous peoples and peoples of the Arctic, we thereby indirectly take decisions on behalf of the states, because we are developing our Arctic communities. We are deciding whether to mine or not, what to mine, to pursue oil exploration on land or not on land, offshore or not offshore. We are determining whether we should build an airport or build a deep water port. And so these decisions, they are taken by the peoples of the Arctic under the current structures recognized by international law as the implementation of self-determination. So the bigger players in all of this, Europe and the Nordics and those who originally colonized us, they also have to change their way of thinking and how they engage and partner with us. And I think that's a very important task on top of everything else for many of the European states, including the Nordic states who have strong ties to the Arctic. What I do wanted to say also is that what has been a big important factor for us, and that I hear also touched upon in your panel there in person, is the question of whether you are able to create unity. Are you able to create a strong sense of not just approaching and pursuing the common denominator, but actually having a common goal? And that is what have made the people of Kalaallit strong in this situation, that we have been able to create unity and a common goal despite our internal differences. And that's something I think has been very clear in the past year as we've seen things develop. And I see that also as one of the very big challenges for Europe as such. Lastly, I do want to say one thing. And I know that there are also experts on the military and security area in the room. To us as peoples of the Arctic, the biggest security threat here and now is climate change. And I think we will do ourselves a big mistake if we forget that. And that is extremely important in our priorities, in our policies, in our ability to re-establish climate cooperation globally. We've seen that fragmentation globally through the UN and otherwise. And we have a big task ahead of us to ensure that we do not forget that, especially for us as Arctic peoples, the biggest security threats continues to be here and now climate change. It is affecting our communities, it is changing our livelihoods, it is literally melting beneath our feet. The infrastructure is melting beneath our feet because the ice is our infrastructure. So this is something that's going to affect everyone, and especially those who want to have a greater partnership and presence in the Arctic. You will not be able to avoid addressing the climate change. It will affect everything in the lives that we lead and everything in the lives that the rest of the people and humanity of this globe will lead in the future. Royana.
Merci, merci Sarlvik. Je crois que c'est un message qui résonne.
Thank you. I think this message.
La jeune génération qui est ici.
Thank you. I think this message strongly resonates with our audience today, and it's also a message supported by Europe in the international debates. Nicole, did you want to react? Yes, I'd like to react on NATO, European defense, and the future of Europe, because if Europe needs to defend itself, you will be the ones who will have to defend it. You, young people, not us, maybe you. And I wanted to say two things. First of all, about NATO. There is a crisis in NATO. Apparently, Trump said he would pull the troops out. And since he was elected, and even since his first term in 2016, we've known that. We knew that we could expect a revolution in NATO overnight, that the US could leave. What are we doing to prepare for the future? Nothing. We did nothing. We talk about European defense. We talk about the European countries in NATO. We are spending billions of euros over the past 4 years on defense industry. So we're making defense industrialists richer in all countries, but this is not creating a European defense. We are enriching the industrial military complex. That's how the leftists used to call it when I was young. The bad guys of armament. That's what's happening. We're saying there's a threat. We're giving money to the industrialists, but we're doing nothing to prepare for the end of NATO. And if it happens, we won't know what to do. And I think the only thing we can do, if we're serious, is to know about the commandment chain of European defense, which means who will replace the Americans. And when you open this debate, it's the worst war between Germans, English, and French. That's why we're not opening the debate. That's the first thing. I am shocked by this European inertia that knows that there's going to be a disaster and is not preparing for it. Second thing, European defense and defense as a whole rely on two things. When you look at the preamble of the NATO treaty, it states it. Defending the territories of the countries of the North Atlantic region and of the representative democracy system, individual values, human rights, etc. That's what the two things are about. And when you look at the white paper of French defense, I was part of it. Jean-Louis was part of a committee. In France, we defend a territory and a political system, democracy, and both work together. And what I feel is a danger today is that when we hear about European defense, we talk about defending territories. That's it. Nobody ever references defending democracy anymore. And this is a setback, a major setback. And I think we should keep an eye on this. Europe, for the youngest here, Europe is not a foreign country. It's not like the US or Burkina Faso. Europe is you, people. So we should be very careful. Yes, to European defense if it's not only defending a territory. Defending the territory of a fascist Europe is not something I'm interested in. Defending the territory of a democratic Europe is worth defending. So we must absolutely be vigilant. This morning we talked about the younger generations. Your duty is to keep an eye on this. There's no defense without defending democracy.
And so the last 5 minutes of this debate, defending democracy, it's the values that defend Ukraine faced of the Russian aggression. So the last question open to them, but you only have 1 minute to answer. The topic of the expansion and the Ukraine joining the European Union, based on what we said on the territory, on the variable geometry. Is it yes or no? Nicole, you were speaking about calendar. How do we deal with very complicated issue? Who wants to answer first? Jean-Louis Bourlange. I did a report on that topic. The minister back then said that it was fantastic. She sent it to the French president. I never had any feedback on it, but it is nevertheless extraordinary. I think that regarding Ukraine, you need to really understand what we want to achieve. We need to show our solidarity with Ukraine. So we need to invent, and this is true for the Balkans globally, we need to invent a new mode of joining the European community, a new political union, absolutely full in immediate with participation in the European Council of the Ukrainian president. That is fundamental with together. And this commitment of Ukraine, this is a basic commitment. Then the Commission policy, the Union policies, all this needs to be progressive and step by step. We need to fight not just in Ukraine, but in all the corrupting, all our European institutions. But it can be done. We need to do this quickly, immediately, without waiting in terms of political integration of Ukraine. But we need to take our time, negotiate protocols and a timeline protocols with all the countries. We shouldn't get to the Ukraine before the other Balkans to join, or the Balkans to join before Ukraine. No, everyone needs to be able to progress at its own rhythm and respect the fundamental obligations that are those of the Union. Gilles, do you want to? And then we are going to close the debate. I absolutely agree 100% with Jean-Louis Bourlange. It's a challenge. We're talking about dreams and projects. We need to re-establish the European project. It's the guarantee of our peace that is fundamental. Every evening there's about 100 drones that are bombing Ukraine. Every month there are more than 200 deaths in the civilian population. Yes, Ukraine is part of Europe, based on all the modalities that Jean-Louis Bourlange has defined, and it's a challenge not just for Ukraine, also a challenge that we can be proud of what has been built since over 80 years, this peace in Europe that is being threatened today from all sides. Thank you very much. And the last word for Nicole. Just a few words. When we told Ukraine that we were going to take it, it was out of political solidarity, since we had the talk, because we have other candidates that have been waiting for years. So we said we're going to take everyone. Considering the state of the world, we can't be continuing as if the widening of the Europe would be the same as in the 1990s. So I agree to slow down the joining of the others, particularly sought. I mean, Serbia is a completely pro-Russian country. I don't see why they would be joining a union where we already have Hungary to manage. So we need to do good sorting through and put a priority in Ukraine by separating two things: the political joining and the technical aspects. But there's nevertheless two Ukrainian issues. The first condition is that Ukraine not be at war anymore, because if Ukraine is at war, that means that we'll be at war with Russia, and though our public opinion wouldn't agree on that. Second condition is the fighting corruption. But that is a struggle that goes beyond Ukraine. There are far more other countries from the European Union that are highly corrupted. And the third condition is that this be agreed by the peoples, the parliaments, and maybe even a referendum. The national assemblies, not just the European Parliament, need to agree on that, and be aligned on that. So we need a policy of preparation, of communication. I think that Ukraine, 1,000 times, by the blood, by its courage, by its resistance, they have deserved to join the last of the Mohicans, that we wish a brave, a resisting member of the Union, and actually, but under certain conditions and on the title. I was thinking of what you said. I would say, Spineless, never. Last of the Mohicans, yes, now. European, tomorrow and forever. One last sentence. Here you have a perfect illustration of what a European compromise is between Nicole and myself. So Nicole is absolutely right on the fact that we need to measure the fact that we participate in fundamental value. Of course, Serbia is absolutely not on the same line as we are. I just wanted to say that up until now, the rule that presides in the widening of the Europe, it's the Copenhagen criteria that were defined 30 years ago. And these criteria say the country that is democratic, that accepts the market economy, and that is able to support competition, they can join. I think we need to add a fourth criteria to Copenhagen, the one who shares the major geopolitical challenges of Europe. And here again, we need to have a European compromise. Thank you. All five of you, Luke and Sarah from Greenland, some publications. The last publication of the Normandy Index of the European Parliament that measures the weak signals of the conflicts around the world. You can find it here in the bookshop and on the website of the European Parliament. It's an index you can realize yourself. I also wanted to mention the last publication of the National Defense Review, 80 years later and multiple challenges, published by the General Police Sergeant. Kisani, your last book, Portrait of a Broken World. You can see it published by Gallimard 2 years ago. General Pellestrandi, the French Army's a very interesting memorandum that was just published in École Nièce-Auto. You're going to sign your book, Fractures in the West. How did we get there? How can we get out of this? Thank you to all of you. And Sarah Olvig, thank you from Kanalit Nunat. And we'll come back on a discussion on Gen Z and discussions on AI and peace, of it all in the program.